There's a puzzling silence about the coronavirus, even as major economic impacts are underway. Hello, everyone. This is Chris Martinson with your COVID-19 update. It's February 17th, 2020, and I'm calling this one a puzzling silence. And I had to take a day off yesterday on the 16th, so thank you for everyone who noticed and wondered how I was. I just needed to get some sleep and catch up on some things around the home. All right, moving on. We go right to the numbers as usual. As you know, I don't trust these numbers very much at all coming out of China, but directionally we can look at them. The cruise ship, though, I trust these numbers a lot, and we saw an increase of 99 cases there. And we're going to talk in a minute about what this means, that we see 19 in serious or critical condition. And of course, these are people receiving the very best of care. Good to see that Singapore's numbers dropped. They had 8 there in the last table that we looked at. Japan has additionally, besides the cruise ship, a bunch of cases that are starting to show up now here as well. And we're seeing a smattering of cases elsewhere, but not that many. And really puzzling to me, places like the United States and Australia really just locked in with almost no new cases. Vietnam at 16, I believe, is a real low ball, and we'll see why in just a second. But there was something that I missed that I wanted to go over. This came out on the 13th of February. I found this now sourced in 4 separate newspapers. I could have found more, so I believe this is true, and I'm not sure why it didn't make it to the front news. Vietnam quarantines area with over 10,000 residents over the coronavirus. So this was in a village in Vietnam that had 10,000 people close to the nation's capital were placed under quarantine on Thursday after 6 cases of the deadly new coronavirus were discovered there. So presumably this is a not entirely high rent district, and this would be a place where people are crammed in a little bit more closely together. And the entire commune of San Loi, about 40 kilometers from Hanoi, was placed under mass quarantine. So this is the first mass quarantine outside of China since the virus emerged. I'm not sure why this wasn't bigger news or how I missed it, because I've been a complete corona news junkie for a while. It took me a while to find that. They're saying here the timeline for the quarantine is for 20 days, but as we've learned from the cruise ship, 20 days becomes however many days with each new case that's come forward. So this came out on February 13th. That's 4 days ago now. I haven't been able to find any updated information whether there are more cases in there or not. I think there's a serious underreporting of cases going on, in particularly examples like this. As well, there's this Westerdam cruise ship incident, which we're going to spell that more correctly here. Um, Incident. Health officials said they found a coronavirus case among the hundreds of passengers who disembarked a cruise ship in Cambodia. And this was after 5 ports rejected it over coronavirus fears. And I guess those fears were well founded. So they weren't fears, that was a rational decision. But now more than 1,000 passengers from the ship have proceeded to destinations around the world. And health officials are struggling to determine how to handle the situation. One expert even said that the incident could mark a turning point in the effort to keep the coronavirus outbreak mostly confined to China. Well, I'm not sure why that's the case. I think the turning point was way back in early, mid-January when we put out our first alert on January 24th, and the WHO officials were out there. Tedros, in particular, was saying, "Hey, nobody should think about interrupting their trade or travel or air transport to and with and from China." That would have been the turning point, I guess, but this could be another turning point. Really, there's no stopping this with its R naught at this stage. It's just a matter of time now. Found that here at Business Insider, so that's certainly something worth watching. As well, when you see something here that says hours ago, I'm recording this at about 2:30, so I gathered most of this data this morning, so this sometime on February 17th. This is interesting. Chinese woman struck down after probation period. So she went through a complete 2-week probation period. And this is a 24-year-old woman struck down with symptoms on the 15th day of quarantine. So that's a day long, ostensibly anybody in a 14-day quarantine could leave. And on the 15th day, the day they leave, bang, down come the symptoms, and was officially diagnosed another 6 days after that. Currently in stable condition, and authorities are scrambling to isolate anyone or everyone she came in contact with. So this just again goes to show that the chronology of this is really, really difficult to stop. This is not the same as SARS. This is not the same as the flu. We have a very long asymptomatic period, and that makes this really a very different beast to try and contain. The only way you can contain it is the way that China has been going about it, which includes incredibly draconian measures to make sure that the entirety of your population is really under lock and key. All right, moving on. Cruise ship stats. This would be the Plague cruise ship. The total on board initially here 3,700 people. They're now 454. That's 12% of that total number have now tested positive, but they've only tested 1,700 of them. So let's do that math. 454 divided by 1,723 gives you 26%. So roughly 1/4 of all the people who have been tested have shown up as being positive for that. So let's imagine then that there's a false negative rate in there, and if that rate is 25%, then the infected ratio would climb to 33%. So this is starting to work into those numbers that some of the larger statisticians have been talking about, which would say that potentially as much as half the world could get infected. Now, cruise ships are pretty bad. I think we have much better chance of containment outside of cruise ships, but on that cruise ship, they must have been running the best containment they could, which is everybody stay in your rooms. We're going to bring you food, and still somehow this managed to spread very, very successfully and aggressively throughout that. As well, we now have some other data from that, which is that 19 of those infected with the coronavirus on the cruise ship in Japan are seriously ill. So remember, this is the main concern. How many people get seriously ill? And if enough of them get seriously ill, some percentage of them will die, particularly the elderly ones in that population cohort. But if enough get seriously ill that your hospital system is overwhelmed, and later I'm going to show you just how complex it is to treat this particular disease when it comes forward. If your hospital system gets overwhelmed, then many of those seriously ill that could have been saved won't be saved because your system can't handle it. All right, right now 19 divided by 454 tells us that about 4% of these people are getting seriously ill, but that's not the appropriate number to divide by, is it? Because these are people, many of these just got sick in the last couple of days. Let's imagine there's a 7-day lag from detection, from showing up with symptoms to being declared serious. That feels about right. It can be as short as 4 or 5 days, as long as 8 or 9, but it takes time. So what happens if we take that into account? We know these 19 who are now presenting as seriously ill were probably infected a while ago. So how long ago? I don't know, but let's say that when they first are detected was 7 days ago. Let's go take the time machine back here and go back to February 10th, 7 days ago, find out that there were 135 cases detected then on that ship. So now 19 divided by 135 gives us 14%. That's a closer number to what we were expecting to see here, which is somewhere around 15 to 20% of people who do get this are going to present as seriously ill. So this is tracking very well with the China data, and that's interesting and also troubling because I think a lot of people were beginning to think that this was really, for some mysterious reason, a condition that was more serious in China. Maybe because of lack of quality of medical care, because of an overwhelmed system, or because of some genetic issues and predispositions. But here we're getting data that says that on the cruise ship, at least, it's beginning to mirror the statistics that we would see having come out of China. And that's with the very best of care being afforded. All right, some other latest news. Macau just couldn't take the economic pressure anymore, and they're allowed to reopen after antivirus closure, and that's because they hadn't seen any cases there in a little while. So they're going to reopen their casinos and have masses come and gather again. Taiwan is reporting 2 new cases of coronavirus, raising the total there to 22. Interesting that these new cases are also presenting without any known contacts to China. So this is now fits the definition of a pandemic, where you have it outside of the border of one nation. It's in at least 2 areas, and it's now replicating and has human-to-human transmission in a local fashion. So Taiwan now part of that as well, joining Singapore, joining Japan, and a few others. All right, this is a little bit old. One new, actually, it's more like 5 more coronavirus cases in Japan, and this is outside of the ones on the cruise ship. So country's total number now stands at 62. 5 new cases, says here, unrelated to the Diamond Princess cruise ship. And uh, Japan really has a big problem on their hands, and not least of which is they really had to dial way back the Boston Marathon, which is a huge deal for them, and also they've got the Olympics coming up. So this is going to really be very difficult for Japan to manage the business interests against the health interests. It's going to be interesting to see how they go about managing that. But finally, the lead story. Coronavirus was finally the lead story this morning, February 17th, on CNN in the US. They spent 15 minutes covering it with various reports on their 8 a.m. in the morning show, Eastern Time. Hey, it's finally, it's been forever. And maybe now we can begin to start to get some traction on this story. And as I went over to the CNN website, I also noted that on the front page, right at the top, we see this big whole box right here, all um, devoted to just coronavirus stories, COVID-19 stories. So things about the passengers' evacuation, stories about people who survived, the marathon that's restricted to elite athletes only, China's destroying some of its cash, kind of interesting story, but cash is a way you can spread this, I guess. There's the thought. So uh, that's being destroyed, and all sorts of stories here, and what it's like to be on a quarantine cruise ship. Oh, I don't even want to read that. I'm sure that's just miserable. Bloomberg as well, above the fold, right at the top here on its online edition. So talking about the U.S. Evacuations here, and stuff going on in Hong Kong and cruise ships and Xi's speech. Interestingly, though, this is something that's really been baffling if you believe in free markets, which I believe we don't have anymore because the markets have been crammed higher all over the world. Look at this. Europe stocks rise with US futures on China lift. And why did China lift? Well, because they're just opening the money floodgates and throwing money into the markets. Why? Well, a bunch of reasons. I think the prime one is because if your markets are rising, it signals to people that all is well. And that's a really important thing to do at the macro level, again, when you are trying to contain or control the narrative around a contamination like this, in a contagion like this. What you have to do is you have to keep um, managing people's expectations and hoping that you can convince everybody things are okay. Because the thing that the public policy officials fear most is this thing called panic, which means, in their minds, uncontained actions by people where people go out and do things that aren't sanctioned, approved of, wanted, desirable, all kinds of things, including, in many cases, even preparing themselves and their own families as best they can. Because once enough people do that, the vibe sort of catches on. And once the vibe catches on, if too many people do that, it really can fall apart quickly. I think you've all heard or read or seen the stories about in Hong Kong, which has a relative handful of cases that their stores are completely stripped of bare necessities. Toilet paper is now the new number one fashion status symbol. If you want to give somebody a gift that really shows you care, it's not a really fancy handbag anymore. It's a whole set of rolls of toilet paper, and that there was even an armed hijacking to steal 1,000 rolls of toilet paper. So that happens in part because people get the vibe that maybe they should go get toilet paper. Too many people do that, and you run out. And once you run out, it becomes its own self-fulfilling thing. So they're trying to control and contain that, and that's why markets rise in many cases. Wall Street Journal still way behind the step in this particular narrative. I would think that this journal, ostensibly being a business journal, would be most concerned with the business impacts of the coronavirus, which are huge, legendary, possibly the most extreme in anybody's lifetime, maybe ever. So this is a really big piece of news. At least they're covering above the fold at the top this morning. They talk about the cruise ship passengers flown home. 14 are infected with the coronavirus. Kind of interesting story there. They weren't supposed to fly any infected home. They had a number of American citizens they wanted to fly home, and as part of that, they tested them, and 14 showed up as infected during that test. So they put them in the back of the plane in a special, quarantine sort of a zone, and they're flying everybody back. So that's good that they're coming back. But Wall Street Journal is noting this, which is interesting, and I guess it's got a human interest story, but it's not about the business itself. The business is the story that I'm tracking really carefully because I think it's the biggest issue. And we're seeing really big industrial production decline. So this is gross Sino or China US trade flows, rolling 12-month sum in billions. And you can see here, this is the Great Recession, Great Financial Crisis in this period right down here. 2016, we had a really solid downturn as well, but that was fought off with wave after wave of monetary stimulus by both the central banks of China and the US and Europe. But this decline right here is absolutely the largest in an absolute amount. Not sure on a percentage amount how it compares here, but it might be as large as that from 2008 through 2000, early 2010. So trade flows already spanked hard. No idea when they are going to actually reverse. And if you remember, stocks went up and up and up all through 2019 because of all these headlines that said positive news about the trade deal, China trade deal almost done, biggest deal ever. And every time we had a headline like that, the US stock market would go up based on trade optimism. Well, this little dip right here just undid, looks like about $150 billion worth of trade flows, which is just swamps anything the China trade deal was hoping to accomplish in that same amount of time. So all I can tell you is that markets are not going up because of anything that's fundamentally rational or reasonable. When we go into Google and just do a couple quick searches about Chinese getting back to work, we find that they are struggling to get back to work. China orders self-quarantine in capital as nation returns to work. Those returning to Beijing must stay home 14 days. Well, maybe 15 or more now, based on that earlier case we just talked about. So that's going to be really hard to get people back to work as they return from wherever they've been, particularly the Chinese New Year, coming home and then having to stay home for 14 days. Obviously, you're not working in a factory if you're doing that. China says coronavirus curbs start to work. Okay, this is really good, but the coronavirus curbs, I believe they are starting to work, but it means having everybody stay home and really, really tightly controlling every single movement of those people. Obviously, for the curbs to work, people aren't working. And that's the clear case here. And I think as well, you can't just quarantine people for 14 days. It takes longer than that. That's what the cruise ship is teaching us. It might be 3 or 4 months of really intensive quarantining to get this coronavirus under control. All right, U.S. factories in China are open, but don't have enough staff. So I guess nominally some of the factories have been open, but a lot of them are talking about having severe shortages of workers due to the coronavirus. And I heard a report, I haven't been able to confirm it, but I heard a report a while back that a couple hundred Chinese workers were ordered back to work. They came back to work. Somebody in that factory tested positive for the coronavirus, and then all 200 people went into quarantine, which in China could mean you end up in one of those stadiums with a cot where you're pretty much certain to get exposed to the coronavirus if you haven't been already. So this is telling us that there's just people aren't getting back to work, and New Zealand companies hit as virus shuts China's factories. There's just tons of stories like this, people. They're all over the place. As well, we're starting to get a lot of anecdotes that are piling up. Found this one on Reddit under our coronavirus by user armed with bars. And again, unverified account. This could be a made up story, but it has that ring of truth to me. So I'm going to share it with you here. This one reads, I work in the furniture business. My company has full furniture imported from China, and for the made in USA stuff, the fabric is imported from China. China makes over 40% of the world's textiles. For a few weeks, we haven't even been able to reach our Chinese vendors, much less get in contact with them. We finally reached our biggest vendor who supplies all our fabrics. The PO dates are insane. For our popular fabrics, we are looking at PO dates around mid-June as of right now. Less popular stuff, it's early August. That's just to get the fabric to the U.S. factory. We are told if factories even open up, they are going to be producing a fraction of the product due to employees being locked down in their home cities. A fraction of the product due to employees being locked down in their home cities. Yep, that's what we're seeing. So this is about furniture, fabrics, textiles. Excuse me. So they continue. We are already running low on our warehouse stock because income tax return is the busiest time of the year. Once we run out, we can't even put in further purchase orders. Since we've already ran out of lighter stock merchandise has been calculated, we've already lost over $1 million in potential sales. My company has close to 100,000 employees, and our jobs are seriously at risk right now. So getting their jobs seriously at risk. People are so focused on the virus, they aren't even realizing that hundreds of thousands of people will be out of work if this continues any longer. I would say millions of people. It's not as simple as sourcing from another country. It's extremely expensive to relocate production to another country. It's also a very slow process. And in some cases, it's an impossible process, as it were, because you need to have an integrated supply chain. Maybe fabrics is easier, but when you think about electronics, it's not as easy as just saying, well, we'll relocate the chipset manufacturing to a different country because you need a fab plant for that. It's a very specialized piece of production, and it might be that you need the other component parts to come from other nearby factories, and so you cluster those, and it's not it, it's a much more difficult problem to get uh, real realigned with some new. You don't just order from somewhere else in the world. So even if this ended tomorrow, they conclude here, there's a good chance our company can tank from this situation. I've already been told by a friend in corporate to get my resume ready to go. The economic fallout from this is going to be life changing. That's my conclusion too. I really do think that's the case. And we've got some macro data as well to support this anecdote. Here we have a report that was compiled by a Cleveland research company, and it's looking at the return to work levels, estimated to be about 30%. That feels about right. So the other way to say that is that about 70% of China is still out of work. And that's as well. This should be ramping up through this whole period of time, and it's just been flat. It's really looks like anybody who was going to return to work kind of, or is kind of there by early February, but not a lot has been happening since. As well, when you look at, in this case, in the city of Guangzhou, looking at passenger traffic or average traffic of in the city here since February 10th, which is when most cities started to return to work, the activity level still well below a normal month. So this is where it kind of was, and now they're reporting, hey, we're seeing this uptick. This is good news. We're getting more traffic, but it's still only 13, 14, 11, and 11%. So basically just over 10% of their normal traffic here. Again, just through February 12th, 5 days old. I'd love to see this data updated a little bit and see what it is today. But still, this is, if you're roughly 10% of what you used to be at, I can imagine that's each unit of travel represents economic activity. It's a truck going with goods somewhere. It's a car bringing somebody to or from something. Maybe they're shopping. Maybe they're going to work. Whatever the story is, traffic represents economic activity. So by this measure, in Guangzhou, economic activity is off by 90%. If you want to look at it that way. All right, at least CNBC is on the job. We just got this one coming out early this morning, and it says coronavirus could impact 5 million companies worldwide. New research shows. Here's the URL for that. And as we read into this story, they said the affected areas with 100 or more confirmed cases as of February 5th. So that's a place with where it's really gone epidemic, at least locally. So affected areas in China with 100 or more confirmed cases are home to more than 90% of all active businesses in China. So that's amazing. 90% of their economically viable areas. Of course, that's where more people are clustered. And of course, the closer people are clustered, the better chance the virus has of spreading. And around 49,000 businesses in these regions are branches and subsidiaries of foreign companies. Yeah, that's just a huge number. How do you even get your arms around a number like that? Dun and Bradstreet researchers found that at least 51,000 companies worldwide, 163 of which are in the Fortune 100, have one or more direct or tier 1 suppliers in the impacted region. So tier 1 meaning you kind of sole source, you really, really depend on having that direct supplier as part of your overall supply chain, while at least 5 million businesses and 938 out of the Fortune 1000, so that's almost all of them, have one or more tier 2 suppliers. I don't know how they've defined that. I'm going to have to dig that up and figure that out, but I think we can sort of guess what that means. They're important, and who knows how many of those tier 2 suppliers combine into tier 1 suppliers and all of that. It's a very hyper interconnected system. So this is just assuming all of their forecasts about how rapidly this might resolve, all assumes a baseline forecast that the spread of the virus is contained by the end of the first quarter. Well, that's a month from now. That would be the end of March, restoring normal economic activity in the second quarter. However, the global economic toll would be severe if the rate of infection and rising death toll do not abate, with international supply chain disruptions amplifying the shock. All right, so here's what has to happen in order for this not to become a really severe situation. The number of cases has to stop growing. And we have to get some sense that this containment has worked and that this virus is now under control. Okay, that's what we'd have to see. What might prevent that from happening? Oh, I don't know. If like Macau says we can't take the economic pressure anymore, or the leadership of China can't take it anymore, and they order people back to work, and then you get another round of outbreaks from this thing because they didn't wait long enough to allow the actual full blown containment of this thing to take hold. So every model I've seen so far says that this thing doesn't actually peak till April or May, and that's if it runs a normal course. It may take longer than that, but I think we can just count on now that there's some sort of amplified shock coming in the system. So the party line right now, and this has been the disappointing part, that yours truly here had his wiki page taken down because I wasn't towing the party line and coming to you directly with what feels like normal, logical conclusions after going through stuff I can find out there in the media. And as well, so this is a great piece. It comes from epsilontheory.com. This is the great Ben Hunt. He writes just amazing pieces. I read them religiously. It's a piece that he wrote. It came out on the 16th. So he wrote as part of this article, here's what WHO Director Tedros wrote in the South China Morning Post op-ed piece just 3 days ago. So that would have been on the 13th of February, because this was penned on the 16th. In addition, a wider strategy is needed to debunk pseudoscience and strengthen trust in everything from vaccination to public institutions. Misinformation thrives where trust in the authorities is weak. Well, I got news for you, Tedros. The reason that trust in authorities is weak is because you did a really terrible job informing people. You did a really terrible job of managing this. You did a really, really spectacularly bad job of doing your job. You acted like the World Trade Organization and attempted to protect travel and trade more than you wanted to protect lives. So that's where, if you say misinformation thrives where trust in authorities is weak, it's not that it's weak, it's that it got destroyed, it got damaged. Weak means it's a passive word. Let's put the active tense on that. You destroyed people's faith in the institution known as WHO. And I'm sure there's a lot of wonderful, very dedicated people who do work at the WHO, but not at the top end. Not where Tedros is hanging out. In a fast evolving disease outbreak, there's a fine line between the deliberate spread of misinformation and the well intentioned but potentially still damaging redistribution of false claims. So they keep coming forward with this idea there's a lot of misinformation and false claims, but they don't say what they are. I would love to see the examples of saying, here's damaging redistribution of a certified false claim. In fact, if anybody wants to refute any of the data that I've been putting out here and say, here's where you got it wrong, I'll admit where I got it wrong because I'm using non-peer reviewed reports. We're operating in a fast and fluid environment. We're doing our very best to get it right, but none of it's being done with the intention of spreading misinformation. But they keep claiming there's a lot of very damaging misinformation, but they never say what it is. And that's a clue to tell you that what they're trying to do is manage the information flow to say everybody should be looking at us, not anywhere else, but they haven't earned that right. In fact, they've dinged that right pretty solidly. And here's a Reuters article, again, from 3 days ago. So this is just on the 13th. I mean, we know tons about this from this virus as of 3 weeks prior to that, right? Here's what Reuters was concerned about. The rise of fake news, including misinformation and inaccurate advice on social media, emphasis on could, make disease outbreaks such as the COVID-19 coronavirus epidemic currently spreading in China worse, according to research published on Friday. In an analysis of how the spread of information affects the spread of a disease, scientists at Britain's East Anglia University, I have to look up who these people are and what their methods were, said any successful efforts to stop people sharing fake news could help save lives. Well, again, no sense of what the fake news here is. And again, without them going into that, it's what they're really waging a war on here is news that isn't coming from an official source. And the implication is that news coming from an official source is good information and that it's not fake news. Well, I'll tell you what. If the WHO was out there saying we need to shut down trade and travel with China immediately, and they said that way back on January 15th, right? If they had said that then, and there was somebody like me or out in the social media sphere coming out saying, no, that's wrong. We should be spreading, we should have more flights and more travel. And why should they be blocking trade? Well, I think they'd be right to say that that sort of fake news could have helped to kill people, right? Because that would have been damaging bad news. So the implication here that it's the WHO who are the purveyors of the good, solid information is not something that we have in the actual data at this point in time. So I'm really sensitive to these sorts of things because they keep talking about misinformation, fake news, but they never talk about exactly what examples they're talking about or how that connects back. But I will tell you that the WHO's early advice on this thing was horrible, and it actually did serve to kill people. And that's just the truth of it as I see it right now. All right, uh, this is a clinical protocol. I want to raise this in case you ever do find yourself needing to understand. If you were in China and you needed to self-treat at home because you felt that your local hospital system was overwhelmed. So this is something I think you should understand around that. And the best clinical protocol data now is out of China. They have many, many tens of thousands of cases where they've worked on it. And so this is what they've come with. Here's the whole thing. It's kind of hard to see because it's small and I couldn't cram it all in. So this part is just from here up. Okay, does that make sense? We're going to go through this part and then this part. First thing, if somebody shows up and they present with a chill, a sore throat, or a cough, already their alarm bells are going off. So what's the first thing they do? They're looking for dyspnea, okay, which is difficult or labored breathing. Is somebody coming in and just having difficulty breathing? Or hypoxia, hypo meaning below or beneath, oxia, oxygen. So if you're either have labored breathing or they see a hypoxia with a 93 or lower reading, 93% or lower, and that's the oxygen saturation of your blood. So each hemoglobin molecule can hold 4 oxygen molecules. And if all the blood in your arteries is fully, fully, fully crammed with 4 oxygen molecules each, you'll get 100% reading. I was surprised because 93% is a pretty high cutoff. It feels to me like what I mean by that is that's not that low, and so they're being very very rigorous and quick about this. So any reading below 93%, and boom, you come way down here and you flow down into this part. We'll look at this second. But if you don't have either of these things, so then they're going to do a blood count. Then they're going to say, well, do you have a fever? If you have a fever over 37.3 Celsius, which isn't that much, that's not that much. That's 99.14 Fahrenheit. If you've got a fever, if you have that, yes, then they're going to do a chest scan, a CT scan, a detection of respiratory virus. So they're going to run a battery of tests. If you don't have a fever and you go down here and they take your count of your absolute lymphocyte counts um, and how many you've got per microliter, at any rate, there's a way that they can just shunt you right out of this whole pathway. But isn't that interesting that it's just 93% or less, and boom, you fall down this tree very quickly to stage 2. Or if you have this fever, they're going to shunt you down here as well. So let's go to part 2 of this real quick. So if you came down that pathway, we came off this and we had blood oxygen below 93%. Woo! You came down here. First thing, they're going to give you supplemental oxygen. They're going to admit you to an isolation ward right away. And then they're going to give you an antiviral and one of 2 antibacterials. And the antibacterials, just in case this is a bacterial pneumonia, they don't know yet. They're just covering all the bases, I think, there. And of course, they're going to find out if you're SARS-CoV-2. That's an interesting way to put it here. SARS-CoV-2 positive. They're not talking here about COVID-19. This is really a SARS. It's very, very close and related to SARS, almost exactly. Very high homology. If you're positive, boom, you're going to a designated hospital, right? Okay, so that's pretty quick to fall down this. If you just have this blood oxygen level below 93% reading, you come cramming right down here. So if you get that reading, off you go. Otherwise, if you came down here and you just had a fever and they're going to look for your, see if you have a respiratory virus. If you have viral pneumonia, okay, they're going to take you down here, isolated observation. They're going to run this test. They're going to give you some respiratory help here and antivirals and things like that. And again, if you're SARS-2 positive, off you go somewhere else. If you don't have viral pneumonia, they put you over here. This is other CAP, which is community acquired pneumonia. And here, just regular treatment for community acquired pneumonia. They're going to transfer you to an undesignated hospital or just discharge you home. And if you don't have that, they're just going to send you home and they're going to give you some prophylactic azithromycin or amoxicillin, some antibiotics. But that's sort of the protocol to test and run somebody through. I thought that might be useful for you if you ever thought you wanted to understand what you would be looking for in somebody. And if, all of us at Peak Prosperity have got those little finger things you put over that can give you those blood oxygen readings as a very cute little device. They're like 20 bucks, 30 bucks. And very useful diagnostic device to have at home. But I thought this was pretty fascinating to find out that was the number one thing they were looking for first was, do you have trouble breathing? And is your blood oxygen below 93%? All right, so now we're going to update this because we got a couple more things to put on here. All of the things in white you've seen before in the prior video updates I put out. Treatment is very complicated and it's complex. And really treating somebody for this is certainly something that's going to require an intact and functioning hospital system with really just great clinicians in it. And we all hope that if we ever get it, that we have access to that complex and complicated treatments. Of course, testing as well often results in false negatives is something we have to put on here now. And yesterday I showed a picture of somebody getting a nasal swab. So it could be that it's a fault of how the test samples are taken. It could be um, that this virus just doesn't have a positive that it's going to give you until it's been in your body for a while. We don't know what those reasons are, but the testing very often results in false negatives. We just don't know how much yet. I don't know. Is it 5% of the time? Is it half the time? We don't know, but it's certainly part of the experience. So that's now on here, and that separates it a little bit because a lot of things are a lot easier to test for, and you get a much higher confidence in the test results. This one seems to be tricky so far. Maybe the tests just need to be refined. All right, conclusions for today. There continues to be just too little coverage of the economic impacts. We think that this is going to be the big thing going forward, that this is going to impact the most people. Still a puzzling silence in the news. Yesterday, Sunday, was almost nothing. I was just trying very hard to find news, and very little coming out of China these days. They've got a super lockdown on that. And as well, China seems to have a lockdown on many of the social media outlets out there in the rest of the world. Reddit's particularly got a couple places that have just been absolutely locked down. And also, where are the cases outside of China? So this is still puzzling, and I'm not sure about that. Are they there but not being detected? We're just gonna have to keep watching this because that's a puzzle. Stock markets right now are not signaling anything useful, hitting all-time new highs, right? Even as the true state of the global economy seems to be, oh my God, this is a shock, potentially a really disruptive shock. A major supply chain disruption is underway, as we saw in the furniture example, but we already know about it in autos, we know about it in pharmaceuticals is coming. Major supply chain disruption, and it only clears up if this thing suddenly resolves and goes away by the end of March, which is, just a month away, month and a half away at this point. So that doesn't seem likely at this point. The WHO and major media remain more concerned about managing the narrative, talking about false stories and misinformation and even fake news, than they seem to be about being really open and helpful to individuals. I understand why they feel like they have to manage things at a macro scale. I understand why they feel they have to take the course they're taking, but they can do that, but they also don't get to then complain about a loss of faith in their institutions, because that comes with the territory if you're going to be incomplete with the story. And finally, the clinical protocol out of China, which has the most experience with this, places the strongest emphasis on those blood oxygen levels and also the breathing, labored breathing. That's the first warning sign. So if I was going to leave you with anything clear about this, it's those two pieces. That's what I'm going to be looking for if it ever comes here, and I feel like I have to uh, self-diagnose in some way to understand if it's time to go to the hospital or what. It's the breathing, labored breathing, and also the blood oxygen levels. All right, I've gone on long enough. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.